more adeptly, or else they're going to be left behind. And it's not only about executing the strategy faster for the executives, but it's also around making decisions faster, being able to compete better in the future, and being able to allow for more cross-functional decision making. A couple of other things that we see. One is, just not having a single view of the customer because of all these different platforms and these different silos. Often, one view of the customer in one department or business unit is different than a view in the customer in a different department. Interesting. In this year, there was a big fintech event over in Europe, in Copenhagen. Over 3,000 attendees, and the main theme of this conference was how financial service firms are changing to approach from a more focus more on the customer and more on the consumer, and looking to identify new processes that meet the customer's needs in innovative ways in order to compete with a quick changing market. So it's interesting that the whole focus on the customer and the client has become that much more relevant. And the other thing is innovation, and which relates to some of the things I talked about earlier, but probably, one of the big areas we're seeing growth in and a lot of investment in is fintech, financial technology startups. And they seem to be winning a lot of times because they seem to be out-innovating the current set of incumbents that are in there. And that's really changing how these larger institutions are reacting. In fact, they can't react fast enough because they have these old legacy systems and this strong focus on the status quo, which is really slowing them down and reacting to these new startups in these fintechs. So innovation continues to be really big. And then, of course, whole area around how do you reduce cost in the challenge of all of these silos. And then finally, the last two, improving the customer experience, that's cited almost consistently. And then finally, employee engagement and retention. So there's a whole range of challenges that are touching on financial services and making it difficult for a lot of financial services to be competitive in today's marketplace. And that lack of competitiveness is in part because of their lack of quick acting, agile type of approach to the business. And that's partially borne out because of the long tenure and history and tradition of the financial services industry. Now, one of the things that we're seeing more and more on is this concept of employee engagement, particularly in financial service firms, and we're seeing more organizations looking to do something different in that whole era. And I'm going to touch on what we're seeing some financial services firms do differently around employee engagement in just a bit. Another interesting area around financial service firms, it seems like a lot of them are starting to divide into two areas. An interesting study released by the Customer Experience Exchange looked at financial service firms, and what they found was there was a difference between some of the financial service firms are really starting to focus on personalization and how they could provide a high-touch, high level of relationships between their employees and their customers. And another group of organizations were much more focused on automation, a lot less on personalization and high touch, and a lot more on automating. And I think that's going to be an ongoing debate, is where you sit on either side of that equation, personalizing and high service relationship, or automation and making it easy and quick and fast and consumer friendly for people to use the banking services that you're providing. All of this is important to employee engagement. Whether you're trying to create an engaged workforce to automate, streamline, reduce costs, you need them engaged, or if you're trying to create an engaged workforce to help drive better relationships, better share of wallet, high levels of personalization. Regardless of the direction, that's what we're seeing more and more in terms of how some of the banks are dividing and some of the financial services are dividing. So I'm going to try to loop back to some of these main challenges, and the reason why I started with business challenges is because employee engagement has to be focused not just on, what makes the employee happy and what makes the employee satisfied at work, but it has to be focused on business performance. and what is going to drive better business performance, because we know better business performance provides greater opportunities for the bank, which provides opportunities for employees, provides growth and more engagement. And it's almost like a chicken and an egg scenario. So I'm going to come back to those in a few minutes. Let me just spend 1 or 2 minutes explaining who TalentMap is, and then jump into some of the tools we're seeing financial service firms work around engagement. One of the things, as a company, TalentMap, and that's who's putting on this webinar today, what we do is we help our clients ask the right questions, analyze the data, and in particular, act on that survey results. Lots of really good companies out there can help you ask the right questions. Lots of good companies can help you analyze data, but that's where a lot of them drop the ball. TalentMap goes above and beyond. We make sure that you do ask the right questions, that they're valid and they're reliable. We use sophisticated techniques to be able to analyze your data, but we go beyond just developing and delivering reports and help you use that data, working with your management team and your leadership team to create viable action plans that really sustain change in your organization. Been in business for a long time, run lots of surveys in a whole range of different areas, do a lot of focus on employee engagement, and have a range of different companies that we work with. A lot of them in the financial services sector, so lots of experience in that area. What I wanted to show here and just touch on before I jump into the tools is we do have a big financial benchmark. We've worked with a whole range of financial service firms, from insurance to investment to retail and corporate lending, down to including credit unions. Even worked in the fintech area, lots of work in that area, and then in government regulations and authorities around regulating financial service firms, and even work with things like the Canadian Bankers Association and so on, different associations working around regulating and supporting the industry itself. So it's a big industry, and we've developed benchmarks around that industry. What we've learned around financial industry, generally speaking, the average or the mean benchmark in financial industries are pretty good. So the average engagement score is around 73 on our index. Lowest score is in around 50s, 59. Maximum score is in around 94. And our top decile score is in around 86. So generally speaking, relative to other industries like retail or hospitality, financial service firms on an average do a fairly good job driving and improving engagement. I always think it's important whenever we talk about engagement to reinforce the definition of engagement. A lot of people say, oh yeah, I know what employee engagement is. Well, I always want to highlight some key aspects of a formal definition. First of all, it's a positive, energized state of mind, and there's 3 important words in here. Positive, you know, that's sort of the obvious, meaning it's positive facing, it's looking forward, it's optimistic. Energized, meaning it's in motion, it's bringing energy to the work or energy to the focus of the individual. And then a state of mind indicates something from a psychology and a survey method, that it is something that is stable or relatively stable over time. So just to give you a sense, someone's personality trait is typically very stable. Doesn't usually change from year to year, month to month. It could change over time, but it doesn't change that quickly. On the other end of the spectrum, a mood is something that could change quite frequently. So it doesn't have a very stable, it's not really typically considered a state of mind. Whereas engagement is a psychological construct that is considered a state of mind and is considered to be fairly stable. That way you can survey in January, review results in February, and be fairly confident the results that you're reviewing in February represents what the state of mind of the employees were around engagement a month earlier. And that's important, and it's a subtle component, but it's an important component that you think about in engagement. The other important side of engagement is it's a level of personal energy. We often call it a cognitive, so how people bring cognitive and emotional investment of energy that's absorbed and transformed into a task. So it's the amount of how people think about their job and how people have emotions about their job, and the level of personal energy people will bring to that, and that it's focused on something. So it's just not, I'm going to have lots of energy on something. Well, it's got to be focused on transforming work, an actual job or task at work, or maybe it's a team goal, or it's an overall organizational outcome. So it could be focused on all three. It could be focused specifically on a task. So you could have job engagement and not so good organizational engagement. You could have very high organizational engagement, maybe not so good job engagement. So it's really focused on that and driving meaningful business objectives. So that's important because there's key aspects of a key definition of engagement that a lot of people misinterpret and don't understand. And thinking about those facts are important, and in particularly the personal energy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the numbers. Needless to say, there's lots of data out there that links high levels of engagement with better business results and low levels of engagement with low business results. And this is just showing the difference between top engaged and bottom engaged quartile units and their difference on things like customer satisfaction, profitability, productivity, turnover, and so on. So you can see things as simple as turnover, a 25% difference between the top quartile and the bottom quartile business units, and even as much as 49%. So quite big, significant differences between business units that score high on engagement and those that score much lower on engagement. And then finally, TalentMap, what we try to do is provide tools for clients, and we have a range of tools. We have tools that allow clients to run their own pulse surveys at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we have services that basically we manage the whole survey process for you. We call it sort of do it yourself, manage it yourself, use our tools, all the way out to leave it to us and we'll manage everything for you. All right, so that's a little bit about TalentMap, and just to touch on, as I mentioned, the challenges in the financial service. And I want to point out a couple of them. One is acting quick based on increasing competition, innovation. These are some of the challenges, and employee engagement. I'm going to pull out that number 3, number 5, and number 8. And I'm going to touch on some tools that seem to help drive better innovation, help organizations act quicker, and help drive higher levels of engagement and retention. And those things are all related. The tool that seems to work a lot in financial services, and of all the industries we work with, financial services seem to be using pulse surveys more than any other sector out there. And we work with healthcare, utilities, government, nonprofits, but it seemed like it's financial services that are really jumping onto this concept of pulse surveys. And I want to touch a little bit about what they are and how they can be used effectively in the financial service sector. First of all, the definition of pulse surveys. It's traditionally an employee survey that's pulse, meaning it's brief, more specific, conducted typically to not always, but a predefined employee group. Usually it's a limited subset of information, not like a full survey. So that's about the biggest definition you'll get. There's no standard definition of what a pulse survey is. It ranges anything from 1 question per month to 15 or 20 questions that are sent out maybe once a year or twice a year. So quite a range and quite a variance in the types of pulse surveys that are out there. The biggest benefit is it allows you to find the smoke and the issues and the hot buttons and the bubbling issues, whether they're employee issues or customer issues, because they are related, before it really becomes a fire. The challenge with a lot of traditional surveys, and traditional surveys are still very effective, but you have to wait for a year or 2 years, depending on how frequently you do them, before you really find out if there's a real issue within the organization. Where in pulse surveys, in the fast-moving financial service industry, we're seeing them use it more and more to understand where that potential smoke could become a fire. And the reason why I think you're seeing in the financial service industry is because of the accelerating pace of change, and we're seeing that more in that industry than probably any other industry out there. As I mentioned earlier, geography doesn't define financial services anymore. It's basically technology, advertising, and regulation. And as the technology continues to expand and speed up, I think we're going to see continually faster paces of changes out there in terms of how this industry has to compete. You know, just to give you some sense, the change from an agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution took about 8,000 years. To move from the industrial revolution to sort of the electric light bulb took 120 years. To the moon landing took us 90 years. To the World Wide Web now, 22 years. Sequencing the whole human genome, 9 years. Now we're into things like Bitcoin and blockchain to be able to actually have digital currency out there, and how do you manage and regulate these, which have just popped up in the last 4 or 5 years, and changing what's going on out there. So a lot of changes out there. The other thing that's happening more and more in the financial services sector is the workforce makeup. For a lot of financial services, they hire a lot of young people, millennials, and millennials look at the workplace different in some respects, not in all respects, but they do look at the workplace differently. One of the things that they look at differently is how frequently they want feedback. This is a preferred frequency of feedback scale at the bottom, and the percentage of respondents. And what we're looking at here are millennials in blue and non-millennials, which are mainly baby boomers in gray. How frequently do they want feedback? So a small percentage, almost daily. So millennials wanting feedback on a real daily basis. Almost 1 in 5 wanted it weekly, which is much higher than the baby boomers. Monthly, almost 50% wanted monthly, and that's higher than all the other groups out there. Quarterly, much less for the millennials, but higher for the others, and annually higher for the others. So you can see the trend towards more frequent feedback across the millennials, and that's partially driven out of the tools and the technology they're using today. They log on, they send a Snapchat, they want to receive a feedback immediately, they send a text. Now they don't even send email because it takes too long to receive something back. So the group of employees that a lot of financial services firms are hiring are really expecting a lot different way in terms of that. And pulse surveys are a tool for financial service firms because they help manage that group and help provide the tools for that group so they can get more regular feedback. Just to give you some benefits of pulse surveys in financial service, it gives them a better time to react to emerging problems before they get, whether it's an employee problem or a customer problem. It's much, much quicker in terms of pulses. So depending on how frequently the pulses are sent out. Helps keep issues on the table as part of an ongoing discussion and decisions about running the business for the executive. So if you're providing pulse surveys on a quarterly, monthly basis, you're able to get measures in front of the executives on a regular basis going into their quarterly update meetings, their monthly meetings or weekly meetings. And what's happening then is employee issues and employee engagement then becomes an ongoing agenda item because they have a measure to look at on a regular basis. It enables real timely measures for issues that are hot for the executive. So if an executive wants to measure a particular issue, like something around what's happened with Brexit over in the UK, or something around diversity or inclusion in the workplace that they feel that is an issue, or bullying in the workplace, what we find is it takes too long for the full annual engagement survey, or if it's biannual, every 2 years. Pulse survey gives an avenue or an opportunity for executives to put some issues on that pulse to be able to get instant feedback or much quicker feedback. The other thing it does is it reduces using the full survey as the catch-all for all those issues that come up through the year. They don't all pile it into the full survey. They keep the full survey to a tight, short 20-minute survey and use pulse surveys to collect other issues that relate to maybe not engagement, but things that are important to the executives. It removes excuses for not acting on results because they're dated or irrelevant. If you're running pulse surveys on an ongoing basis, you have real-time data. You can't say, oh, well, those survey results they're from last, November, or they're from last June, they're not relevant anymore, our workforce has changed, and so on. Pulses keep it a lot more relevant and a lot more in your face. And it actually can act as a very effective employee relations strategy. The fact that you're doing pulses help employees in the millennial side feel that they're being listened to on a regular basis. And being listened to is something that they expect more, as we saw in the previous item I put up there around how frequently they want feedback. However, despite all the benefits, there are some drawbacks of pulse surveys within financial firms. First of all, they can be lots of great survey tools out there, SurveyMonkey and so on, but they can really be damaging if you have an inexperienced team developing and launching these surveys. It really just adds to that garbage in, garbage out. If you're just going out and adding more surveys out there, you're really not getting good information out there. So having the tools doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have better surveys or better information if you have an inexperienced team deploying the surveys in-house. Another big challenge is just over-surveying. Often organizations will use pulses but survey too often. And as a result, managers may not pay attention to the survey pulses because they're coming in so frequently. They may not feel they can act as quickly, and so on. So there can be a challenge around over-surveying. So thinking about your survey strategy is important. It does cost a little bit more, whether it's your time in-house or bringing an outside vendor in. There is a small investment, maybe not as big as your full engagement survey, but there is additional investment around that. It potentially reduces response rates and lower accountability, meaning if you're running lots of surveys, eventually people go, oh, well, that's just the pulse survey. It's not really part of our performance management process or performance management issues. And it could create overload if it's not managed properly. So all of these drawbacks are you can mitigate against if you manage it properly, but you have to be aware of them when they go out. In financial service firms, there's really 3 or 4 types of pulse surveys we see used most often. One type is a snapshot pulse. It's just a quick picture of what's on the hearts and minds of a certain segment of a population. So we sometimes see snapshot pulses go out to new hires that have been brought on in the last year, and understanding how the orientation onboarding process has gone for them. Or we've seen people who have moved and transferred from one department to another. Pulses going out around how that process has worked. So very narrow niches. So that's a snapshot pulse. Another, and this is probably the most common indicator for pulses in financial services, is performance indicators. Really what they are is an index score or a subset of questions from your full engagement survey that are used on a monthly or quarterly basis to measure like professional growth or like employee engagement. So this is the one that's most commonly or most frequently used in financial service firms around collecting feedback. Audience specific or top specific is another one. And then finally, follow-up surveys. Follow-up surveys are often used, the second most common in financial firms, and that's really around, following up on a survey that was out there. What's improved? What's changed? Did you participate in the employee action team? Did you learn about the key drivers? Has your manager shared the information with you? And so on. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples of pulses out there in a couple of different segments, and then I'll look at some samples on the financial services side. This is Nordstrom's. Nordstrom's really in our city. They just opened up a new store. They run a interesting pulse check. You can do it on any floor that you're working on, and basically they have a number of faces on the survey, and people just quickly hit, are they excited, happy, neutral, sad, or angry, and each day you can actually go in, creates an automatic pie chart. You can select the location and pick the date and the mode, whether it's done online or by kiosk, and actually see what people are thinking and feeling of the organization. So with different ways organizations are using pulses. Another one, and we're seeing more and more of these on mobile phones, where you can swipe, swipe right, I'm happy, swipe left, I'm not so happy, how do you feel about your priorities this week? Another example, 145 completes in here, gives you that, and you can actually map this out over time and sort of see, are there sort of trends across certain days or certain weeks. Tuesday looks like it's a down day. Why is that, and so on. Other organizations, another one interesting in here is like it's called, I think it's called Cellpex. A device they have when people are going home at the end of the day. Green is good, red is not so good. How was your day? And people are indicating in there, and that gives them a pulse and a sense of what's going on. So just to give you a sense of what's out there around a couple of different tools that different firms are using. Quickly, when you say a pulse survey, what are some pulse questions that are asked? In addition to an employee engagement index, like 6 questions in there, sometimes you ask very short, quick questions, like how do you feel about coming to work every morning? Or does your manager inspire you? Or choose 5 words that best describe how you feel about coming to work, and that's an open-ended. Do you feel proud to tell others you work here? These are the types of questions you often see in pulse surveys, and they're very quick, very short, often 1-question survey that are sent out, and then the reports are generated back to the manager immediately. Lots of administrative methodologies to consider. So running pulses, even though they seem technology simple, and they are from a deployment point of view, you have to think about a couple of key things. One is, a lot of surveys are typically administered in real time, and that's helpful. But are the reporting going to be done in real time? What about sampling? If you're only getting a subset of your group, how do you interpret that subset? A lot of different assumptions are made with pulse surveys that are different from your full survey. And those assumptions can change the way managers interpret the data, or should interpret the data. And if you don't prepare managers properly, they'll often use the pulse survey results and under the same set of assumptions that they have from the full survey results. And those aren't the same set of assumptions. You have to set expectations differently, and you have to manage expectations differently. So there is lots of methodology considerations that are important. Let me just touch on a couple of financial firms that use TalentMap pulse surveys. One is an insurance firm that uses pulse survey to check in against progress in areas that they decided to use action plans for. And basically what they found when they did this, so basically the full survey went out in January. They followed up 6 months later with a short pulse survey, and the pulse was focused on their key drivers, vision, communication, professional growth. And what they found is the results were mixed, which was very helpful because they felt that some actions were clearly working out, but others required changes. So they actually put some programs in place. They started to implement those programs, and they went back to employees and they said, how are these programs working? And they quickly found out that, hey, some of these programs are working well. Other ones weren't working at all. Managers weren't implementing, or they didn't understand them very well. So it saved the organization from making a full mistake and waiting for a full year to find out if their investment in these programs were flawed. And that allowed them to react quicker, more innovative in terms of change, and adjust in midstream what was working from a people program point of view. Another example is a retail banking client. They use pulse surveys to examine manager effectiveness. This is not a 360. It was just around management effectiveness, and they did it ongoing. And the pulses revealed employee concerns around the quality of coaching and feedback. And that's something you hear more and more about, is managers are supposed to act as coaches and provide mentorship, but they're not too sure how to do that. And what this organization said, well, we're implementing a coaching process, and we're implementing pulse surveys from employees to understand how well the program is working. What it did is it revamped their coaching program based on feedback into a much more standardized process, and end up training the managers a lot more. They realized that they had not trained their manager very well. They didn't have a very standardized process for all the different managers around what coaching is, how to provide strong, positive and constructive feedback and how to deal with difficult conversations. So it really ensured some standards across the whole bank in terms of doing that. So again, the value of pulses in these examples, it allowed people to use the feedback much quicker after the survey, focused on a very specific area that they wanted to collect feedback on. Just an example of a TalentMap Pulse survey. This is a one-question one that goes out. You know, do you see yourself working here in 1 year? It's on a 10-point scale. No, I have 1 foot out the door. Or yes, I love my company. You know, anywhere from a 10 to a 1, and they can actually write in an open comment, a 1 question, they hit submit. Data comes in, and then the actual manager would actually be able to see the results of their scores across the employees, get their average, their benchmark, number of replies, and so on, so they can quickly see what's working and what isn't working. So just to wrap up here, and I just want to summarize with you know, there is a lot of ongoing challenges, lots of examples with financial services of how do they create you know, better trust in the workplace, how do they create an environment for millennials. And what we've noticed is that pulse surveys can be a very effective tool to help your organization act quicker, make changes more rapidly, signal to employees, in particular millennial employees, that you're interested in ongoing feedback on a regular basis, and also to be able to use that data to make change and keep what's important, which is employee engagement, front and center in front of the executives. However, pulse surveys can absolutely take your survey program to another level and your engagement to a very higher level, but they're not a substitute for a regular full content survey. The full content survey provides a real rich data set that allows sophisticated statistical analysis, comprehensive reporting, action planning at all levels of the organization. A pulse survey is typically not designed to do that. So they are very different tools, but both of them are very effective and can be used. And most organizations are complementing their full engagement process, so it's done annually or biannually, with more frequent pulse surveys to be able to act and change and become a more agile organization. You know, a pulse survey is a real valuable tool, but should be seen as a complement to your full content, you know, along with other types of qualitative and quantitative research. Technology, just having great pulse surveys and not a full engagement survey is not the solution either. You know, technology solution doesn't solve engagement. Leadership, management, education helps to do that. Yes, technology can be an enabler, and pulse surveys can help do that and provide greater feedback so managers have greater awareness, but it is just an enabler. So implementing new technology for engagement is not going to solve an engagement challenge or issue, but it can help you, point you in the right direction. And remember, no matter what, we've learned that without action, a survey can be damaging, whether it's a full survey or a pulse survey. The lack of action is usually considered the Achilles heel in almost every survey process, and often the kiss of death, regardless of it's a pulse survey or a full survey. Without a process to act and a set of expectations to act, a lot of managers will struggle with how to use the results. I'm not going to touch on expectations, but one of the biggest things is setting proper expectations for pulse surveys, which are different for setting expectations for full engagement surveys. What should be set at a pulse level is really setting the expectation that reports are going to be at a much higher level typically. They're not going to be drilled down reports necessarily. There's not going to be an expectation that all the results are going to be cascaded out. So different set of expectations should be set up differently on how the survey results are used. I'm going to stop there. Kelly, maybe I'll turn it back over to you and let you wrap up and address questions that may have come up.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, we have a question that came up. From your experience, how much time does it take for a firm to see tangible results after applying an employee engagement program?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually what we see is two aspects of that. From an engagement survey, the fact that you're just going out and asking employees for their feedback actually drives a bit of engagement. So the fact that, hey, they're asking for my opinion drives that engagement up, and that's good to see. But it's not sustainable. So it does bump it up in a short term. Well, what has to be sustainable is some specific actions that have taken place. And what we see is usually there's one or two what we call, quick wins, or, the proverbial low-hanging fruit that's out there, things that you can grab and quickly get to. So, for example, someone says, right, I'm not clear about the vision and strategy, or I'm not clear, I don't see our senior leadership team very often. That's some things that usually, with some adjustments around behaviors at the leadership level, they can get out and communicate their vision, or they can get out into the offices and locations and be more visible on a regular basis. And you can measure that. So those are some quick wins that you see, and those you should be able to see within 3 to 4 months of any survey program. What's harder and takes longer is much more systematic changes. So if you had to change your hiring process based on some survey feedback, or you had to change your leadership development program or your performance management program, that obviously can take quite a bit longer and could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months. But I would expect changes every year in your engagement program. On average, we see companies that share their survey results and that act on their survey results, so use their survey results to drive change, we see on average a 5-point increase in employee engagement. So an organization that scored 65% on the engagement questions, 6 engagement questions, move up to a 70%. Or someone who moves a 70 moves to a 75%. So on average, some of them have moved up as high as 20 points. So we do see change, but the average change is about 5 points. Kelly?
Great, thank you. So Sean, if you just want to go back to the event slide just before, we have a number of events coming up. The next one that we have coming up is actually in Halton area. It's a chapter event with HRPA, and Sean will be speaking about employee survey feedback from data to action to results. And then we have a number of conferences that are coming up that we're highlighting here. One in Albany, New York. Sean will be speaking on from employee engagement to employee experience, which is one of our hot topics right now that Sean is touring with. And then we also have OMRA conference coming up, HRIA, HRMA. So we're going to be heading across Canada as well as down into New York. So if you're in any of those areas, please pop by and say hello to us, because we'll probably have a booth at a couple of them as well. And that's everything. So if anybody has any other questions, I'll just double check if there's any more. No, I think we're good, Sean. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to call the number here on the slide or email info@talentmap.com. And once again, we'll have a copy of this video recording as well as the slide deck that you can utilize at your disposal internally at your company. We'll have that in about 5 business days, and also you'll have an email. If you're on our mailing list, you'll get an email with the slide deck and video as well. Okay, so thank you so much everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us in the future with other webinars.